they don't read it, and it didn't go nowhere. I mean, no doctor got a hold of it. Dr. Price, back then,
I know, and next week's Christmas Eve. Nope. Well, I've got everybody's presents but my in-laws. My family and my husband's family do Christmas differently, and so my family, we have just switched to only doing presents for the kids and not for the grown-ups. And then my husband's family, we are the only ones his parents see at the holidays of his siblings, so they tend to go all out for us. And so I try to buy them a couple of presents in return. But I've got my father-in-law 2 presents, but I still haven't figured out what to give my mother-in-law. And we're seeing them on Friday and Saturday.
Wow, Friday.
Yeah.
I guess it's time to get started here for these things to get started. Wow. Good to see Kent. And I'm thinking we're beginning, after this is our 3rd Sunday now, and so we're beginning to see people that are here, but we just didn't get to see, like Rick Burris. Love Rick Burris. What a great guy. What a soft heart for kids, and I just love the way he loves kids and encourages kids. Did you? I remember the first trip we took to Honduras. Was it Honduras? Yeah, Honduras. And I had, because I'd done mission trips before, it was Rick's first time, and I had put a lot of candy in my suitcase. And I said, did you bring any candy? And like, I don't know about candy. And I'm like, okay, you are the candy man. I am giving all my candy when we get to Honduras to you, and your job is just to, because I know you're a kid magnet. And so, and he was, and he gave candy out, and it was great. So,
Jared called him the kids ambassador.
Yes. And Jerry, I do remember it was that same trip, I think, that, shoo, wow, I know you remember it. We were in the trailing truck, and Jerry fell out of the back, right? I don't remember all of the truck in front of us, but your leg got caught, and you were being dragged along the road before the truck could get stopped, and these big boulders just boom, boom, boom like that. You remember that? Wow. Yeah, and just lots of memories, George. Yeah. I don't know if you're still singing some, right? Yeah. So, lots of memories. Teresa Andrade, and just names that come flooding in to the mind, and just a deep appreciation that I have. Dana and I spent lunch and a little bit of time with Alicia Colglazer, and just kind of going down memory lane. And it's just it's just when you put one foot in front of the other, and you're faithfully trying to serve God, and you do that in quiet ways that sometimes maybe that you don't appreciate. And I know there's some value in that, but once in a while God gives us a little reminder, that salt and light, and the difference that that He can make through our lives. And it's just great to know that, because there's a lot in life that's discouraging. Have you noticed? Yeah. So just hang in and keep doing, the next right thing, church. It would be my encouragement. Well, we've been spending this class time looking at the way a particular writer of a gospel frames the beginning of the story of Jesus. Matthew and Luke both have birth narratives, but Mark and John, of course, don't really have that. And yet each evangelist would tell the same story of Jesus, but would frame it uniquely, and in an attempt to really raise some themes that will be developed in his gospel. And so we've been looking at that, and today we're going to come to Matthew, and that leaves John for next week, perhaps. I don't know what will happen there. We're not going to be with you next week. But anyway, we're going to be in Matthew today if you want to be turning there. And if you were here last week, you know that we threw out this idea that I think has some good merit, that the Gospel of Matthew may have been written a drama or even maybe a tragedy, some people would think, and yet, you know, it was not a tragedy, was it? The story of Jesus is not a tragedy. But it just has some very distinctive characteristics of Greek drama or tragedies that were being performed during that time. And there are a lot of amphitheater ruins, small theaters all throughout the area that, you know, that this was part of their culture, and that so that Mark may have been written kind of specifically to be performed. I don't know. I like the idea because I think the performing arts are such a powerful tool, have a potential of being a very powerful tool for good. But anyway, if last week we were listening to Mark, or reading Mark as a play of sorts, then we turn to Matthew, and it's as though we suddenly find ourselves in school, right? Because the Gospel of Matthew is written like a carefully constructed textbook when you look at it. And I mean, it's got some detail and some information, all right? So we're just going to start with that idea. And I don't want to get too much into just the uniqueness of maybe Matthew's approach to the story of Jesus just yet. But what do you know about the structure of Matthew? Just kind of the overall structure of the book that is of interest, and even in itself gives some clue as to its audience and why it was written, especially why it was written the way it was.
Seems to be written with Jews in mind. The genealogy, for example, starts with Abraham and not Adam.
Okay.
If you go to Luke, the genealogy starts with Adam.
Okay. Definitely. Matthew and Luke have genealogies, but they're very different, right? And this is interesting. Matthew begins with the genealogy. Luke kind of buries the lead in a way. That's a term, you know, news term, I guess, and I don't really mean it, but but you know, the genealogy in Luke shows up in chapter 3. We've already been over that material, I guess, but that he pays particular attention to John the Baptist and throws John and the prophecy of the birth, and he is kind of in tandem with the story of Jesus because Luke is really wanting to call attention to something there. But Matthew just starts with the genealogy. What else? Just structure-wise. So, you know, I didn't really want to go over stuff that, like, we all know, all right? And kind of, you know, this is stuff we know, tell me something new. But the Gospel of Matthew has in it 5 summary kind of transitional statements in it. And we can note, let's just kind of notice this for a moment. We won't maybe spend a whole lot of time on this, but chapter 7 and verse 28. Matthew says, when Jesus had finished saying these things. In other words, okay, so let me back up a minute. There are sections of teaching that are interspersed with narrative in Matthew. So when Matthew starts with some narrative or some stories, which lead to teaching, and these teaching blocks, and when he's done with a certain teaching, in this case, you have what? Sermon on the Mount material. Then you have this summary in verse 28 when Jesus had finished saying these things. Now look over at chapter 11 and verse 1. See if I can get there.
Verse what?
Verse 1. After Jesus had finished instructing his disciples, just really, the English is a little bit different, but the Greek is, even much more similar. After Jesus finished saying these things. Look at chapter 13 and verse 53. Let's see. Here, where is it? Okay. When Jesus had finished these parables, and then chapter 19 and verse 1, when Jesus had finished saying these things, there seems to be a little clue here. In other words, it's kind of like Matthew is saying, okay, back to the story. But it seems that Matthew can be divided into 5 blocks of teaching. Does that ring a bell with anybody that he would choose 5, not 3, not 6, but 5? And that he would begin the first teaching block with, this is the beginning, or record of the genealogy. And he would use this word Genesis. Now Mark uses the Greek word arche, beginning, but Matthew uses another Greek word for beginning, and he chooses Genesis. Are we 5 teaching blocks starting with Genesis? We've got the Torah here. We've got the first 5 books of Moses. It's though Matthew is arranging his material deliberately, like this is kind of the new Torah. These are the 5 books of, you're familiar with the Torah, the 5 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? So isn't that interesting? We're gonna build on this in a minute. Now, some people are not really totally satisfied with that, some biblical scholars. So there are, if we just looked at 5 temporal summaries, in other words, kind of transitions chronologically as he's telling the story, they call attention to 2 temporal transitional statements. Don't worry about, but chapter 4 and verse 17, let's notice this. Chapter 4, verse 17, from that time on, and then you have a similar statement in chapter 16 and verse 21, from that time on. And when you analyze it, it seems that Matthew, if you look at it kind of in thirds, that Matthew starts with just the person of Jesus. And then there's this long section of the teaching of Jesus. And then there's this section from, 16 and verse, 16, 21. Then the third part is about kind of the revelation of, so that you've got the person of Jesus, he's the Messiah. You've got the teaching of Jesus, he's the Messiah. This is the Messiah's teaching. And then this third section, this is the revelation of the Messiah. It might be news to you if you haven't been reading Isaiah, but this is the one who's going to be crucified and would be raised on the third day. So he's kind of revealing something about this Messiah and what surprised the people, even though the religious leaders had the book of Isaiah and should have been familiar with the suffering servant songs. It just completely messed with their mind that they had such different view of what the Messiah would do when he came. How is it he would be put to death? You've got a lot of explanation. You have Isaiah 53 and these passages that this is in keeping with
Earthly king,
Yeah.
something very flashy and,
Yeah.
and we sometimes miss that focus.
Well, we do, don't we? I'm glad we don't do that anymore. That was sarcastic, wasn't it? I'm sorry. But that's, I'll make mention of this in the sermon maybe, but this is kind of an aside for a moment. But I know that rightly so, people say, don't forget the reason for the season. It's Christmas. What has helped me in my mind, and maybe it's helped some of you, is to say, okay, this is Christmas, but I want to observe a time, Advent. And I use that word because it helps me distinguish that, my focus this time of season is not on the holiday calendar as much as, where I want it to be a time when I really spend some time thinking about the coming of Christ into this world the first time and when he's coming back. And so Advent tells my mind, focus on that, because it's so easy to get caught up in the consumerism. It's so easy to get caught up in the busyness, in the anxiously. We've got so much stuff to get done so that we can celebrate a celebration of our own making here. We kind of do it to ourselves, and so you can get through the Christmas season and have never really thought about what it means that Christ came into the world and that he's coming back. Does that make sense? I didn't need to go there probably, but so anyway, just calling your attention to a couple of ways that you can look at Matthew. There's one biblical scholar that I appreciate, though I don't hold all of his convictions by any means, and all. It's Luke Timothy Johnson, really good New Testament scholar. And so he says, he says it can really be both. We don't have to decide between one and the other. But I think there's really something here for us in terms of Matthew could be broken up into 5 books when you begin to think about what it is that Matthew was trying to do. Okay, let's go there for a moment. Look at Acts chapter 6 and verse 7. And this, by the way, is it Act? That's not right. That's not right. Oh, I'm in John. No, never mind. I need to be over in... Yeah, there you go. You know that Luke, all the writers have, there's a lot more stylistic. They just didn't, do like I do and just kind of start writing random thoughts and put it all down, and there's no thought as to, style and structure and all of that. So in the book of Acts, you've got these transitional statements as well, and chapter 6 and verse 7 is one of those. It says, so the word of God spread, the number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and here's what I want us to notice here, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. The church was growing. It was just amazing how fast the good news spread and the church grew. And so you got these statements about how much the church continued to grow, and later on, despite the conflict and all, that was the persecution and all, it continued to grow because the gospel is powerful. It's the word of God, and nothing's going to hinder it. But here you have, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. And so the thought is that there were a lot of priests that were becoming followers of Jesus, and they were going back into their synagogues teaching, and they needed some material to work from. And of course they didn't have that immediately. Matthew's written later, but they needed some teaching. They needed a catechism, if in a sense. They needed teaching about this new Messiah, and so that they would have material that they could share with their congregation. And that Matthew wrote this book as sort of an instructional manual. It's for all people, but he wrote it particularly in mind with these priests, and he wrote it in a way that would really resonate with them and be helpful to them. Does that make sense? Any thought on that? And then if you're a detective, you can look at a scene, and it seems that, regardless at least on TV, this is the way it works, right? That there's this little clue right here that everybody else missed, but I see it, Again, aside here for a moment, but I read a book on the FBI and all of their forensics and hair and fiber and bombs and all this kind of stuff. It was just fascinating. When Dana and I first started ministry, we were in Chicago, and there was the Tylenol murders. Do you remember that? And the FBI was somebody had tainted some packaging, and they were trying to get a hold of a handle on what's going on and try to at least stop, the distribution. So they pulled all the Tylenol off the shelves, if you remember. And it's like, how do we even begin looking at this? And there was a rookie FBI agent who really specialized in chemistry, and he says, well, we're looking for cyanide, and cyanide glows under X-ray. And they're like, brilliant. They loaded up all the Tylenol. They took it to O'Hare Airport, and they ran it through the X-ray machines, and they found the lot numbers and all, and were beginning to. So that kind of stuff. That's fascinating to me, all right? I'm just kind of wandering around here. So you have a little clue over in Matthew chapter 3 and verse 52. I think it's one of these clues you go, yeah, you kind of left a little bit of a footprint here, It says, Jesus said to them, therefore every teacher of the law who has been instructed about the kingdom of heaven is like the owner of a house who brings out of his storeroom new treasures as well as old. I think, there's a little clue right there. I mean, chapter 13 and verse 52. Did I say? Okay. I'm sorry. You got to read my mind. Yeah, that's very interesting. Every teacher of the law who has been instructed about the kingdom of God. And then he's kind of giving them a little advice here, or saying, here's what you're basically doing. You are bringing out of your storeroom new treasures as well as old. That was given to me when I was preaching in St. Louis. Somebody was trying to help me out as best as they could. And they said, Dale, yeah, we're a rather new congregation, and so maybe 75-80% of the church are new Christians. But there's a sizable part of the church that we've been following Jesus for a long time. So when you do your sermons, it would be good for you to bring out a little of the old as well as the new. Kind of bring that out, So that was very helpful. I got advice and all, but that was one piece that was very helpful to me. Okay, so now what are you thinking? Any thoughts? I just wanted to kind of give us the structure, and then we'll just kind of go back and look at some of the stuff that Matthew specifically does. But anything on that, just in terms of structure? There's no question to be, embarrassed about, or there's no bad questions. Okay. So I've already said that Matthew, as opposed to Mark, and I think as opposed to Luke, there's several Greek words for beginning and all, and there's several different Greek words for birth. We're going to notice that when Matthew finally gets around, I'm saying that tongue in cheek, like verse 18, this is how the birth of Jesus came about. He uses this word Genesis. And he's not really there, at least. He's not talking about this is the birth of Jesus, because it's later in verse 20, verse 2, chapter 2 and verse 1 in our book that we just have a quick, you've got 7 and 7, and then 7 and 7, and then 7 and 7. That's a significant number, right? In Jewish thought. It conveys this idea of perfection. Then when you get to the 7 of sevens, the 49th, who do you think the person is who's mentioned? It's there. It's the end of the line. This one who was born of Mary, this Jesus, who is called the Christ. It's like, I don't think that's accidental. And then here's more fun. The first group of 14 ends with, as you've said, John, David. And David is a big thing. He's really being the spotlight's really being put on him. And so this is what, now here we won't go too far in all of this, but there was a popular way, a Jewish way of interpretation that was kind of focused on, let's see, what's it called? Gematria. It's a Jewish interpretive method that assigns numbers to each Hebrew letter. So that if you're trying to emphasize David, another way to do it subtly that we don't notice, but if you're steeped in Hebrew and the Jewish culture and thought, David would be 3 letters in Hebrew: Dalet, Vav, Dalet. So D, V, D for our purposes, okay? D would be the number 4. It's the 4th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, right? So it would equal 4. And V would be 6, and 4, David, D, David, right? You with me? 4 plus 6 plus 4 is 14. There's some stuff here that we might miss, but you can begin to appreciate how these priests, Jewish priests who had come to faith, really found a lot of rich material that they could use in their Bible classes, like we're using today, right? People would go, wow, that is amazing, yeah. This Jesus is the Messiah, and he's the rightful heir to the throne of David. Somebody, yep.
Was he showing them that they didn't have to lose their Jewishness in order to follow Christ?
Well, yeah.
Still keep their Jewish traditions and still follow Christ?
Yeah, definitely.
So,
You know, what's the Sermon on the Mount?
that seems like a really hard thing to do. You know, they're seeing this religion that they've been part of become more and more Gentile.
Sure.
And they probably felt like they were losing themselves. So this was a
Would be
map,
helpful, wouldn't it?
a
Yeah.
map almost to help them keep their traditions alive,
Yeah.
and yet still follow.
And even to see that, hey, you know, Jesus is the fulfillment of all of where we've had our faith, you know, in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We've been awaiting the kingdom of David. And Jesus is the fulfillment of that in ways that we would never known, you know. And so even Jesus would say, you have heard that it was said, but I tell you, the Sermon on the Mount is so demanding. If you thought the law was demanding, to me, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, I'm calling you to not just the letter of the law, but I'm calling you to what God intended when he gave this law, and that's a lot more demanding. So you just see that, yeah, throughout Matthew. Okay, let's see. Okay, what else do we... So, okay, here's something. At least in the King James, I can't get away from that too much, but it's like so-and-so begat so-and-so. I think the NIV, it's, was the father of, and the father of, and the father of. And you just have this in the father of, and the father of, and the father of, and the father of, and the father of. And there's a hiccup. It's like, wait. What? Yeah. Where? Okay. That hiccup is in verse 16 when it says, and Jacob was the father of Joseph. Then you've got the husband. It's not that Jesus is of Joseph. It's that Jesus is of Mary. And Joseph is only mentioned in a sense as being the father of Mary. You just have this hiccup you're almost kind of used to this rhythm, and then you've got this, which calls attention, doesn't it, to Jesus? But why else might that be there? You have to kind of put yourself back, in first century Palestine and the scandal, the rumors that were spreading around about Jesus and who this guy was. And some of it was, most of it, if it was not, good news, but it was bad, trying to discredit.
Relevant that both Mary and Joseph had connections to David.
Probably. Yeah, thank you.
So you've got the legal son in
Yes.
Matthew, and you've got the natural son in Luke. So
Okay, yeah.
she's 100% right.
Right.
Mary
Yeah.
and Joseph are descended from David.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong. Matthew believes that that Joseph is the legal father of Jesus, and he's got him in there. But there was a lot of scuttlebutt running around that about this whole unwed teenager and Jesus, and who is this guy? And there was definitely in the Gospels you pick up on some of this stuff, and Matthew's going to hit it dead on. It's like there's some scuttlebutt around here in the Jewish community that don't want to accept that Jesus is the rightful heir to the throne of David and that he is the Messiah and all. And so we're just going to talk about that right off the get-go. And he starts with this hiccup.
Or something. Anyhow.
That they were what?
Like Shelley said,
Okay.
related to David, in the lineage of David.
Yeah. What else is unique about Matthew? And I,
Staying with the Jewishness of it, he's the son of Abraham, he's the line of David, he's the new Moses.
okay, you're ahead of us a little bit.
He also mentions 5 women.
He mentions 5 women in here, and you're going, oh, what? And who are these women? Tamar, Rahab.
Bathsheba.
She's not mentioned, but we know who it is. Bathsheba. I'm losing my... Ruth.
And Mary.
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah, Ruth. And you think, well, if you're going to mention women, why don't you mention Sarah? I mean, there's a lot of other women that you could mention, but you've mentioned these 4, and kind of in association with Mary. And why is that? Now, here's a funny moment. I've got to tell you, I told somebody, don't ever say at all. So, here's one. There is out the inclusive version of the Bible. And so it's like, well, Matthew mentions some women, but he just didn't quite get it all right. And so so the inclusive version of the Bible here puts all of the women in it. Okay? And it completely misses the point. Completely misses the point. Matthew's trying to make a point here by calling our attention to 4 women. Yeah.
Could it be partly because of who Matthew is? Because he is one of the apostles. Besides John, he's the only one that wrote one of the Gospels.
Sure, okay.
He was a Jew, but he was also an outsider. And he depicts a lot of people who felt like they were outsiders, who weren't, that weren't, on the
Yeah,
in.
okay.
Because he was a tax collector, he's chosen, and I think he appreciated this being included.
Right. Okay, yeah, I really like that. These women are like kind of scandalous. You know the story of Tamar. You know the story of Bathsheba. And Rahab. I mean, and then you think, well, what did Ruth ever do? And for one, she's an outsider. And she might have been a little forward in her approach to Boaz. If you kind of dig into the kind of the cultural of what was it? Covering the feet and all that. It might have been a little like aggressive, sort of, in a sense, and you're like, assertive. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think Matthew is addressing this head on, this problem that might be out there, and he's saying,
Matthew was tainted with scandal, and so was Bathsheba.
Sure.
And David, because he murdered Uriah,
Yeah.
who was Bathsheba's
Yeah.
wife.
Yeah. So he's establishing Jesus is the rightful heir and the fulfillment of all the promises about this kingdom of David that will be established. But along the way, God has worked through some bizarre situations, even some scandalous situations, right? And the Bible class would nod their head, and he said, so is it any surprising that his Messiah would come in maybe a bizarre and perhaps scandalous way? And they would have to say, no, I guess not. God, this is consistent with what we know of God.
Does this make anybody else feel good? I mean, we sometimes look at things that happen in the Bible as all, they're in this little bubble, but they were real people. They made real mistakes.
Yeah.
It helps me to forgive myself
Sure, yeah.
of things that I've done in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And see how God has worked through them.
Yeah.
To glorify.
I think that's a very good point. So you can see how this would kind of preach, or how this would really go over if you're teaching a group of Jewish priests, and here, we're
Not go over well.
Who's saying that? Why? Okay, why?
Well, because Jesus was supposed to be perfect. He was perfect.
Yeah,
And here it is showing that he's coming from the line of imperfect people,
yeah,
as we all do.
sure. Well, he's just trying, and people are expecting, perfection, and it's like, well, Jesus is perfection, but God has always worked through imperfect people. Aren't we glad? Because he really had no other alternative. Yeah.
Dale?
Yes.
Was he pointing out things that were kind of hush-hush that people didn't want to talk about?
Maybe. Yeah.
Just a question.
Yeah.
I didn't really think about it.
But it was maybe they didn't want to talk about it, but it was really there, and it was bothering them. John?
In Matthew chapter 21, verse 33, Jesus is talking about the Pharisees, and he says, I tell you the truth, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom ahead of you.
Yes. Back to your outsider point that you made. That was very offensive. That did not go over well. I can guarantee you that. Okay, we've run out of time. Wow, we were going to get to the birth of Christ and in this Isaiah passage, and then the Magi that come, which is just an incredible point.
Yes, you have to come back next week.
Yeah. If you've got John Shepherd here. You remember, I know that one time before we left in 2013, we watched the Bethlehem Star with our universe so precise and as it is. We've been able to kind of go back and to reinvent, in a sense, to recreate what the sky was about this time of year, And I think 7 BC or so, not once, not twice, but 3 times, you've got Saturn and Jupiter in conjunction. And you've got these magi, these astrologers, or that are watching the night sky, because the idea is that anything important that's going to happen on Earth is going to be, you're going to see it in the sky and vice versa. And so they're seeing the king planet, Jupiter, in conjunction with Saturn. And I think there was even Venus figures in there somehow and all. And it was telling them that something is happening, in that there is being born a king of the Jews. And of course, those magi probably go back to Daniel and his school, and they're probably familiar with some Old Testament, and maybe not. I don't know. But the sky is telling them they need to go to Jerusalem, and it's only when they get to Jerusalem then there's the Micah passage that instructs them to go to Bethlehem, and we know that story. And so you've got a lot of things happening here. Real quick, I'll summarize that Jesus, this one that's born in the manger, is the true King of the Jews, of the tribe of, he's in the lineage of David, and he is the true king, not Herod. He's a pretender. He's a wannabe. He's not the guy. You can appreciate that Herod is threatened by this baby and what's beginning to happen. And so there's the killing of all of the innocents. Yeah, and the people that Matthew is talking to are people, contemporary that had lived through and experienced all of this, So amazing stuff. Definitely. They were not in the manger, Yeah, good point. We stopped short of, there's some hints here that not only David, but Jesus is the new Moses. And it sets up then the Sermon on the Mount, that Jesus is the greater Moses. He's the new Moses. He's greater than Moses, and he's the one that's going to really help us to understand and live into what God gave our forefathers centuries before, and that fits right in with, Matthew is trying to instruct these Jewish priests, I think, to appreciate that. Well, we've run out of time, so thank you. We'll just stop right now. And we'll have a little moment to stir before worship.